Oh, wow. I am just going to start this video by saying Antonio Conte, I love him. Spurs, I do think they're being limited by some of the parameters that are being imposed on them by their owner. And I'm interested to see what these explosive comments lead to in the Premier League. Do you think Antonio Conte loses his job within the next 24 hours because of what he said about Spurs? Or do you think calling a spade is the right way to go with Antonio? There are plenty of reasons why he said it. There are plenty of reasons for us to unpack ourselves. And it's not as simple and as straightforward as you think, as ever. Now, I'd imagine at this point that Spurs fans are slightly sick of hearing people evaluate their club that maybe don't understand the heart and soul of what it is that goes on at Spurs. So within that, what I want to say is, do Spurs fans agree with a lot of what people are saying here? Or do you feel defensive about Spurs, something that is changing and you aren't quite sure whether you have control over it? Whether you're going to the game every week and you're seeing what Levy's doing and the people above him, the people below him, but it's not your Spurs. Because it's easy for a Chelsea fan, a Liverpool fan, and all these other people to go, hey, this is what's wrong here. But what is it that you guys actually want? Is it success or is it beautiful football? Is it to enjoy going to this brilliant stadium every week and just competing? Or is it that because you lost out a couple of years ago, you want to prove that? You want to keep Harry Kane? You want to show ambition within this club? Is there something that people are missing? Are we just going off old tropes of Spurs? I'd love to know what you guys think. Welcome back to Laurence McKenna channel. I love talking Antonio Conte. He is box office. He's taken Spurs to a whole other level. And frankly, I think he's better than the previous management that have been there. Having said that, I've also laid out what I would say is a cohesive argument for this being his last season at Spurs. But also, in that video, I made the case for him going at the end of the season. There is now a case for Antonio Conte being in the job not that much longer. And why? The explosive comments after their 3-3 draw, where Spurs were ahead and then lost the lead to Southampton. Last minute stuff happened. Conte is an emotional guy and I love to see his reactions. I love Antonio Conte for how invested he is in the game, for how much he knows about this being about legacy, about the memories that he gives to people, about the emotions, about the feelings of the whole thing, about how important those things are. But at the same time, the emphasis of everything that Antonio Conte, Martello, the hammer that they call him in Italy, puts on things can also make a pressure cooker of an environment for Spurs. And frankly, I don't know if that works at every club. I think clubs have to carefully select whether they press the Antonio Conte button, because when you go with Conte, you're in 100% or you're out 100%. And there isn't really a mealy-mouthed middle ground, which is what Spurs have been used to for a little while now. Having said that, they had quite a few managers who have been so committed to their principles. Poch was extremely committed. He got rid of so many players that needed getting rid of at Spurs. Mourinho has always been committed to the cause of, well, that's right, Jose Mourinho. And then, of course, very quickly they realised that another Portuguese manager wasn't the one for them. So, going for Antonio Conte was a bit of a high-profile, I want to say hiring for Spurs, but it felt like a signing, didn't it? It felt like a marquee manager was going to take this club to the next level. And you can see he struggled to get there. Now, that can't only be because he says there's a lack of investment. I think it's not so much the money that's been put into the club, but also the kind of recruitment strategy that Spurs have gone down. Bear in mind, that recruitment strategy has mostly been run by and based around one of Antonio Conte's good friends, who is now very limited within the game because he can no longer really operate in the same way because, well, legal situations have bound him. But that has changed the significant issues at Spurs to be like DEFCON 1. Now Spurs are basically just like, do we keep Conte? Can we keep Conte? If we don't keep Conte, do we keep Harry Kane? If we don't keep Kane, can we keep Conte? If we don't keep Kane, can we attract new high-profile managers? And then all around that, any big high-profile manager watching this, not that they wouldn't have known this anyway about Spurs because managers talk anyway, because agents talk, because people talk within the game, but Conte calling it out so publicly, Conte saying Spurs have not won a trophy in 20 years under this very owner because of how they treat the club, because of the structure they've set in place, because the players aren't used to putting themselves through stress, because the players aren't used to putting themselves through, because the players aren't used to putting themselves through stress in difficult, high-pressure situations. It's fascinating. And Conte has had this publicly play out over the last few weeks, and it has gotten to this level where now Conte needs to respond with an emotional, performative element very publicly. And bear in mind, there is a lot that is performative about Antonio Conte. These managers know exactly what they're saying when they step out there in press conferences. They know when they need to be emotional. They know when they need to appeal to the press, when they need to appeal to the players, when they need to appeal to the fans. These guys are trained in this stuff, and they're very high-end managers for this reason. But at the same time, sometimes the emotions can take over on people. Sometimes it gets away from them. And that is why managers get sacked. That's why managers have to move on. That's why clubs have to move on. And it does seem a little bit as if there are times where you think, if Conte doesn't get the win, he's lost the dressing room. If Conte doesn't get that perfect apex Spurs, the players sort of go, well, because of the way he approaches it, cool, well, we're not going to get that either. And so Conte has basically got them on a fine balancing act between brilliant and, here's the thing, not awful, but just meh. But that meh is awful in comparison to everything else, because Conte's window of excellence is so far this way, or at least his perceived window of excellence is so far this way, but anything that goes even halfway beyond central for him is disaster. And within that disaster, you know that there is a roller coaster of emotions for the players. You can see players already getting frustrated. Richarlison calling it out in public, saying he isn't playing where he wants to play in the right way enough, all these kind of things. And Conte just wasn't having it. Conte just came straight out and, yeah, you're right, you haven't played great this season. And frankly, I think you can take that both ways, right? Because you can say, hey, Conte is right to call him out. This guy hasn't had a great season. But at the same time, he's the one who's fielding him. He's the one who's asked for him. He's the one who's gone through the recruitment process. Or is he? You hope he is. He's the one who's gone through the recruitment process. He's the one who's putting this team together around Harry Kane, around that midfield. And frankly, when you look below the top level players, or even some of the mid-level players that Spurs have signed, there isn't much under the hood. I like Skip. I think he makes... In fact, at this point, I actually think he's better than Højbjerg. I thought Højbjerg was a better player than Skip. Maybe at this point, I actually think I'm wrong about that. I think Skip is much better on the turn. I think he is very good at getting Spurs from A to B. It's part of the reason why they've wasted Basuma in their midfield as well. Obviously, the injuries haven't helped, but they've also wasted Basuma in their midfield. Their back line that's built around Dyer and Romero very often hasn't been great. They don't have a goalkeeper that's a leader. They don't really have a complete set of fullbacks at the moment that can kind of do what Conte needs them to do. And they signed Jed Spence, a fantastic young fullback at the time, to fulfill that. But Conte needs 28, 29-year-olds who are at their peak, who are willing to put their bodies on the line, who are going to be old school professionals, not these new school players who Conte doesn't seem to like. Conte speaks in old school, but that old school appeals to some very modern people, right? And in many ways, it appealed to Spurs because those guys had what they considered to be high game standards. They play a brilliant kind of football. They are the team that, even though they don't win stuff, they still play really good football, and you can respect that and all these kind of things. But that was never going to be the case with Conte. It was going to be the opposite. It was going to be, we're not going to play pleasant football, but we are going to win things. We're going to get rid of this hoodoo. And once we've done that, hey, the relationship with Conte can end because that pressure cooker will pressurize and pressure, but the players are cooked by the end of it, right? So within that, Spurs have kind of signed a deal with the devil, but in this case, a deal with Conte, where they sell their soul in the short term. Their soul being that they think they play beautiful football. Their soul being, hey, we want to be X. And after that, what then? After that, it was, well, get us a Carabao Cup, get us an FA Cup, get us somewhere in Europe. Well, they crashed out of Europe in an apathetic manner, a manner which you would say is not suiting of Spurs, but it's so reminiscent of old school Conte because they just went through the motions. The players didn't even really seemed to be numb to the situation, if not sort of, we're going through this, but I'm so exhausted and I don't really know what's going on. What do I do from here? Premier League, sure, they might miss out on top four at this point. They've given away 2 points against the Southampton side that in this kind of run-in with Manchester United in reach just ahead of them, they need to show that killer instinct. And that's the problem. Units this season out on the pitch have let teams down. Spurs substitutions haven't always had the quality that they need within them. Units of the front line have been fantastic, but they're let down by the structure of a midfield. Harry Kane's been dropping deep in order to bring Kulusevski and Son into things, possibly Richarlison at times. But when those things aren't working, then nor are Spurs. And the midfield, which needs to be working, it doesn't have a semblance of a team that has quality in it. Sure, you can bring a Bentancur in, but if there is injuries, you're in trouble. That has derailed a lot of Spurs seasons. They've ended up relying on players that are trying to do impressions of these other players. The back line, there is quality in there, but when you see Romero doing crazy things like he's been doing in some of these games, when you see that Dyer is also mentally seems to be waning in a way, and you see that it's not a leader of a goalkeeper at the back, it's just someone who you basically go, hey, you fit a mould of a goalkeeper, you're in there, sure. And then really, you're just bit-parting players after that. And then you've really got the fullbacks, who Conte's teams are so important. The perception was that Conte will be able to build any fullback up because he's built so many mediocre players up. But you realize that the pieces that just get put together by Conte, they have to have specific switches that Conte can actually flick. And Conte's tried flicking these switches with these players. Conte has tried to bring these players, shaking them into life. Pre-season, he put them through the normal Conte pre-season. Some of them didn't look willing to suffer. Some of them weren't happy in those situations. A lot of people not used to what was going on, not used to, maybe it was a bit of a shock to the system, but sometimes when players go into shock, they freeze, sometimes they play well. And then, of course, Conte lost a lot of people close to him. He's been through surgery. You'd imagine there is a lot of kind of, I guess, epiphany moments, come to Jesus, come to whatever you want to call it, moments this season, where it's basically been, what am I leaving behind? What am I doing with what is going on here? Am I wasting my time at Spurs? And so many people have asked those questions. Are Spurs wasting their time? Is Conte wasting his time? Who's wasting their time in hurrying up with Spurs? Is Harry Kane wasting his time at Spurs? Sure, he could get a record, but will that record be completely overlooked because it was for Spurs, where he never got a piece of silverware? All these questions that show that it can't just be about an ownership going tick, tick, tick. There has to be a culture at the club, a culture that is set by the leaders. And if the leaders aren't in harmony with Conte, then you are in trouble. Now, all of these things might seem like a lot of cliches, but when I looked back through Conte's career, when I made a documentary about him, and then I followed it ever since, I realized Conte was obsessed with success, but success through respect, success through hard work, success through principles within the game that resonated with that generation. Those things still ring true, but in the same way, in the same paradigm as we've been discussing with Antonio Conte, in the same way that you would go, hey, I can remember Antonio Conte as a player. I can remember him as a coach at Juventus. How many of these players remember that? How many of these players know that? How many times are they just going, I know that name, but do I know the records, the big hits from Antonio Conte, the Inter Milans, the Juventuses, the Chelseas? At Chelsea, he built that culture. He was building on the shoulders of giants at that point. Previous managers who'd gone by, who had left really great prints for him to put his feet in and essentially go, you're willing to sacrifice for them? Are you willing to sacrifice for me? You did short life cycles with them? Will you do a short life cycle with me? I will only be here in X time, but will we go through war together? Will we go out there and leave everything? Will we make our opponents eat grass? Well, we make our opponents spit blood and our players eat grass, because that's what he wants his players to do. I have empathy and sympathy for Antonio Conte. I think he's a brilliant human being. I think he's someone who the game should be valuing, and we should be calling out some of these bureaucratic wastes of institutional brilliance that they have out there. Big clubs which have brilliant stadiums and seemingly tick all the keeping up with the Joneses boxes. But that car that's sitting on the drive that's leased out, that house that you're just making up some payments on, that job that you're barely keeping because you just want to keep up with other people. They've gone through the motions rather than getting ahead of other people, and you could see that from the second they got rid of Pochettino. Will Conte go through the same thing? Will this manager go through the same pain that someone like Poch went through? Because frankly, the club let those people get away with it and made a crossroads decision at that point where it was, are we with the players or are we the institution? I'd love to know what Spurs fans think. I'd love to know if you guys are as committed to this cause, or if you feel as passionate as Antonio Conte does. Or is Conte just passionate because Conte cares about Conte? Because Conte wants to preserve brand Conte at this point? Because he is worried that back in Italy, people are going, what is going on? Because in Italy, this is humiliation. Being ahead and not being able to control a game, that is what irks these guys. The basic principles of Conte are clearly within the club, but the execution is clearly not there. Now that's a basic. But why? I think I've broken down some of it better. I'd love to hear from Spurs fans down below. What is it that you guys think is going wrong? Would you replace him with a Poch? Would you replace him with Luis Enrique? Would you replace him with, an up-and-coming manager from somewhere else? Someone who's a little more mild-mannered, someone who fits the Spurs mold just a little bit more than Antonio Conte? Because clearly, he's not getting pressed in by whatever confines and restraints were put on him before. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and I'll be back in a little while. Much love.